to take you with me wherever I go. These introductions are I have to live up to them. To Calvin and to the entire worship team, thank you so much. You've led us to the Lord. It's so powerful. That last song that we did, do you really believe that? Is that really your prayer? Spirit, lead me to where my trust has no borders. Take me deep into the waters where I can grow stronger and be more. Is that really what? That's not the way Southern Californians usually pray. That's where I'm pastoring now. Is that the way you pray here? Well, that's what I want to think about for a few moments. I'm going to come back to the very same text I talked about the last time, but look at it in a little bit of a different way. And actually that song, and I don't know who picked that out, is what this text is all about that we just read. It's written by a pastor named James. He was the brother of Jesus. He was a pastor of a big church. It had started small, but in Jerusalem had grown to be huge. And it was popular with everyone. And then suddenly, persecution hit. And people were dying. People were being run out of the cities. And as his people were being run out of the city, he would write them this letter, the book of James. And if you have a Bible, or you can look on your phone if you want, he wrote them this letter to people he really loved, people he really cared about, but who were going through really tough times. They were having to exercise faith beyond the borders. They were walking into the deep waters. They were losing their jobs. They were being tempted to give up their faith altogether. And so he writes them this letter. And in this letter, there are just two phrases I want you to grab hold of. The first one is in verse 2, that everything that God lets happen, he lets happen for this reason, that you and I might be mature, complete, lacking nothing. So that's what God wants to have happen in your life, and mine too. He wants us to become mature, complete, lacking nothing, where our faith becomes stronger. Now, if I were to ask you the question, what if you had a year ahead of you in which your life was more complete than it is now, what would that look like? Well, we have a lot of students in my church. They go to Caltech or Azusa Pacific University or to Biola. And so I ask a lot of them that question, and their answers were often like this. Well, a year, everything's complete. I'd finished school. I'd got all my school debt covered. I'd be able to get a job. A couple of them said, I want to get married. Then that would be a complete year. I'm a pastor, so you know what I would say. You can have all those things. Those are good things. You can have all those things, and still your life might not be complete. And you can have all those things taken away, and you can still have a life that is complete. So here it is. God wants, the longing of the eternal God who made us is that our lives, it's a beautiful thing, will be mature, complete, and lacking nothing. But in verse 4 is the second phrase I want you to see. But you must believe and not doubt. So here's when I read those two things side by side, some of the things that God brings into our lives to do some great things in us, to make us complete and mature, are the very same things that might test our very belief in Him and might make us doubt. So I just want to tell you something here, that if we're going to have a life that is the life God made us to have, then we have to let Him build it. He has to be at the heart of it. Then those other kinds of things that are good things that I long for too, a good health, finishing school, not having so much debt that you can actually somehow survive after you get out of school, then those things can be add-ons that you can rejoice about. But God has to be at the center, because if we build our lives on even good things, when those things are gone because they're temporary, our lives are going to crumble. Now, does this make any sense to you? So I have a group of younger pastors that I work with, and also we have some interns. And actually, I think my son was with me at the same time we were talking about this. I said, what is this like in this world? So that anybody who listens to me can believe a word of what I'm saying. That God has to be at the heart of this thing, or it's going to crumble. And my son, who's an artist and teaches graphic design here, made me aware of an artist in Scotland. His name's Andy Goldsworthy. He does wonderful things. So I went and Googled him. And he takes all sorts of mediums, and he builds often beautiful pieces of art out in the outside areas of beautiful Scotland. I have one piece here I want you to show you that I really like. Yeah, that one. It's a beautiful piece of work, but can you imagine using the natural materials, how hard that is to build? He talks about when he tries to build this beautiful piece of art, as God is wanting to do with us, building us into something that's complete and lacking nothing. he said that sometimes as he was building on this, he would realize, he'd been spending a lot of time, he would realize that there would be a flaw in the material and what he was building, but he didn't want to start all over again, so he kept building on top of it. Kind of like us, don't you think? And eventually, well, I'll just let him he did a video of him making this thing. I'm going to show you one little snippet of it. You might want to go and watch the whole thing on YouTube. Every time I watch that thing, when he does, I feel it. Do you feel that too? Where there's something you've been hoping for, something you've been building for. I mean, athletes, you know what this is like, building for a big season and then an injury comes. A relationship you've been wanting to work out and then that person goes out with somebody else. Everything that you think you're going to be building on, it just seems like everything collapses. And God turns to us and he says, you've got to let me build. I love the phrase he says, when we try to control, that might be the beginning of the end of things. That we have to let him take control. So here's the point. That God says that in this imperfect world, that he works all things together for our good. Romans 8:28, all things together for the good of those who love him. And that good is he's going to make us complete and lacking nothing. But the problem is that sometimes there are some of the things in his all of the things that we don't want to be there. And those things are usually difficult times and trials. And the point is this, that the Bible keeps teaching us that God uses everything he brings into our lives to shape us and to make us into something beautiful. But sometimes the thing that he uses most effectively are the difficult times, the trials, the very things we don't want to have come into our lives. The Bible teaches that from beginning to end. Those of you who are psych majors, you know that psychologists tell us that as well. I mean, the Bible says you and I are made in the image of God. And so we are made with such huge capacity to do so many great things. But even psychologists look at us as human beings and say, each one of us has incredible capacity, but what we have to experience is something that creates a bit of stress outside of comfort zones, stretching us beyond where we would want to be. I mean, we have so many athletes here at TIU. Can you imagine that any good coach that he says, go out, or she says, go out and run 5 miles. You go out and run a half mile and say, coach, I'm pretty tired. Oh, okay, that's enough. You can go home. I'll tell you what's going to happen. You get into the fourth quarter, and the game is tight, and the other team is fit, and you aren't, and you're going to think, I wish I'd run that 5 miles. Soccer players, you get to the 89th minute, and it's 1-1, and the other team has actually put in the work, and you're going to wish, why didn't I put in that extra mile? God says, I know what I'm doing. You got to trust me. Sometimes I stretch you and take you into places where the waters are deep, like you said you want him to do. Oh, man, I don't know if I ever really sang that song before. I was sitting next to Brad and say, do we really believe that? Do we really want to sing that? We want him to stretch us into those difficult places because the Bible keeps telling us it's when we go into those places and actually trust him in the midst of them that we find that he's there and that our faith grows deeper. I know this is true. It's not just true in athletics. It's true in our walk with God too. Many of you have been on mission trips, haven't you? Have you ever gone into places where people just have nothing? I'm a pastor in an urban community. We have kids who are trying to get out of gangs, trying to get off drugs, whose families have run them out of their homes. And I find them sometimes the most faith-filled people in our entire church. I've been in communities. I was in a church in India where the pastor had told me that 70% of his people didn't have enough food to eat. And when I got to be with them, they were the most joy-filled, peace-filled, and even generous people that I've ever met. I'll tell you this, for many people who are longtime churchgoers, and I'm guessing this is really true of a lot of Christian university students, it's when trials come that we find out that we really don't believe at all. We were just in it out of habit because our parents made us go. And I found on the other side that it's often when somebody who says, I'm an unbeliever, I'm a scoffer, goes through a real trial, like facing death, that person finds out that he believes that there must actually be a God. It's happened so often. There has to be more, they think, in this life than just living and dying. There has to be something beyond this. So whatever you're going through, that often creates these issues of doubt. are things that we have to learn to know that a good God knows what he's doing and we trust him. And if we will handle them right, instead of destroying us, they can make us. The issue is, how do we handle them? And you know I don't have time in the chapel time I have left to say very much about this, right? Because the faculty would be really mad with me if I go too much longer than I usually do. So I'm going to let Pastor James walk us through it. It is so simple. I want you to just chew on the three things he says. I pray that the Spirit of God might take it and apply it to your heart. So what does he say? He says, okay, when those deep waters come, you're to the borders, the margins of the borders. The first thing we have to do, it starts with our minds, because our lives with God almost always start here. What we put into our minds, where we go with it. And the word that James uses in verse 2 is consider. Consider. And we use our mind to consider two things. Consider the trial itself, a joy, he says. That's hard. And then in verse 4, he says, if that is true, that there's some joy in that trial, then we've got to let God finish his work. Let him do what he wants to do in our lives through that trial, and try it instead of running away from it too fast. So let's think about that. Consider it a joy. Now, you know that could be a cruel thing. God up in heaven saying, I know they're going through some tough times down there in Deerfield, Illinois. But just consider it a joy. You'll be okay while God's up in heaven. It's kind of like when I was president here, I had a lot of California friends, and we would have these polar vortex weeks happening, kind of like you've been happening. And they would write me these letters of them being out, getting a suntan on the beach. In fact, I still have one of the posters that one of them sent to me, if you could find that thing. My favorite part of winter is watching it on TV from California. Now, I'm going to tell you, when I used to get those things, I didn't think it was all that funny. Of course, now I live in Southern California. Maybe I've grown up. Maybe I think it's funnier now that I live there. I'm not going to tell you about that. But is that the way that God treats us? That he just says, you're going through a hard time. That's because you're there. I tell you, that's not. So we have to understand what it is that God's trying to do and what he means when he says you should count it a joy when the difficult time comes. And it doesn't mean that you and I should just run into trials, because they're going to make me stronger, so I'm going to just mess things up so that I'll have a hard time. It can't be that. And he doesn't mean that the trial itself is something to laugh about. Trials are often painful things in our lives. I think I've told some of you, my wife and I lost our second child in infancy. I'm telling you, that was nothing to laugh about. My only brother was killed by a drunk driver down in Laredo, Texas. You don't laugh about trials. So what on earth does he mean? I think it gets at what this word what this word joy is getting at. And the pastor who was at my church, Lake Avenue Church before me, his name was Gordon Kirk, defined it in a way that had made such an impression on my church people that when I talked about this, they gave me his definition. And this is what he said. The joy that James talks about is the positive confidence that comes from knowing and trusting Jesus Christ regardless of the circumstances. Look at that for a minute. I kind of like what he says. If we really try to think about it, it means, number one, knowing what we actually believe about Jesus. Does he really care about what we do? Is this message that is at the heart of being a follower of Jesus, that he loves us so much that he gave his life for us? Is that something we really believe? And beyond that, is he powerful enough that death couldn't even hold him, that he defeated it through a resurrection? So you see, we consider, what do we believe? And if we consider that we actually do believe that about Jesus, then there must be some reason why the trial we're going through is happening in our lives. And then we think about who he is, and remember this promise from James 1:2, that he promises to use whatever happens in our lives to do something wonderful in our lives and in our world. So I've got to ask you, do you believe that? Because if you do, then you know that if the difficulty you're walking through is the very vehicle that God is going to use to do a wonderful thing in you and through you, then you'll see there's some joy in it. Does this make sense to you so far? So that when the tough time comes, we stop, We stop. We're made in God's image. We have the ability to think about what we believe. We consider whether we really believe all these things that have been said, and consider there must be some joy in this, and that changes the situation. Now, I talked to my church, but I took a whole sermon to talk about that one point. And afterwards, one of our Caltech students, Caltech is right close to us, doing a PhD in science, and he came through and he said, well, Pastor Greg, that was a pretty good sermon. Now I know how to think about all my troubles. The only thing I don't know is what to do when they come. And I said, oh, all right, next week. You got to come to church next week. And so I'll just move you there quickly too, because James takes that up in verses 5 through 8. James was a Jewish man, and what he says, it's got to move from your head from your mind into your will. And the second point he makes is, if you don't know what to do, ask God. And the way he puts it is, if you lack wisdom, ask God. James was a Jewish man. He wasn't thinking of wisdom as some Eastern guru kind of sitting in a lotus position and spouting out philosophy. He was just saying, by wisdom, it's how God made us to live. So when tough times come, and you don't know what he's doing, you've got to take time to sit and ask God. Now, one guy came up after this and he said, all right, you went to Trinity Evangelical Divinity School and got a Master's of Divinity. You have a PhD in theology, and that's all you have to give us when tough times comes? Ask God. And I said, yeah. Like a child, we go to our Father and say, Lord, I know I'm supposed to pull back and think about this, but when trials come, it just batters you so hard sometimes you can't think straight. Have you ever been there? Times when I just didn't feel like I could even sleep, didn't know what to do. And in those times, sometimes my prayer is like this: Father, this is happening. I don't understand it. I don't even understand why you let this kind of thing happen. Lord, I don't know what to do. Show me what to do. Now, perhaps you're here, and I know many of you have been in church many, many times, and you would say, well, I've done that 1,000 times, Pastor. And sometimes I do it, but I still don't always see all the things I'm supposed to do. And I'll tell you, I've never seen all the things I'm supposed to do. I've been a follower of Jesus for over 50 years. So I'll just tell you how my experience has been with this. I come to the Lord and said, Lord, I don't know what to do. And almost always when I stop and say, show me, he at least shows me one thing that I know without any question that's what he would have me to do. Now, I've got to warn you about this one. Often the one thing he shows me is the one thing I don't want to do. That, I've got to go to somebody and open up my life and say, I'm really sorry I did this. I've got to be the one who takes the first step and say, I'm really sorry about our broken, things that are just uncomfortable. I've got to tell you, the other thing is he doesn't show me all the things that I'd like to know. Because so many times I'd like to say, well, I've got to see where all this is going to lead before I take the first step. But what I so often get, and I think you'll find this to be the case too, is enough clarity about something that you will know the next step to take. So it starts in your mind. Consider what you believe. Do you really believe about Jesus, what we have been singing about today? We allow that to go into the will. Ask him, what do you want me to do? And that leads us to the third part, last part. And it's the hardest one, that when we ask him and we get some clarity about what to do, then, what does it say up there? We've got to do what God says. It actually says, it moves from the will into action. It actually says, when you ask, believe and don't doubt. You see the way I retranslated it? You've got to act in faith and not be divided about the matter. Now, many Bible students tell me that they don't understand what James is getting at in verses 6 through 8. You've got to ask and not doubt, or you're going to be blown here and there. And I tell you, it's not hard to understand what he's saying. You know what's hard about this? It is obeying what he's saying. That's what I have found to be the case. And again, there are these two words that were really the two things that Scott asked me to talk about. He says, when you ask, you must believe. And many people have misunderstood that. It's almost this idea, as if I believe hard enough that God will do what I want him to do, he has to do it. I believe you for $10 billion to come to Dr. Washington. I see you sitting out there. I'm trying to get you to wake up there, Dr. Watson. So, and sometimes God does that because we have the freedom as his children to come into his presence and ask anything. But I'm telling you, that's not what James is saying here. It's not me becoming his Lord. It's me saying, I don't know what to do. I seek your will. I will do what you want me to do. That's what he's saying here. Francis Chan talked about this matter that when we ask him, we enter into the presence of God and he shows us something we should do, we need to act on it. He said, how is it that we as Christians here in the United States have gotten to the point that when we read what God would have us to do or sense in prayer what God would have us to do, we sort of study it? He said, can you imagine? I would ask my daughter Rachel, say to my daughter Rachel, go up and clean your room. It is a mess. And the next day she would come down and say, Dad, you'll be really happy with me. I memorized what you told me to do yesterday. Rach, your room is a mess. Go clean it up. See, I memorized. And I invited over all of my closest friends yesterday. And we studied every word of what you told us to do. Isn't that a great thing, Dad? And we began to envision what my room would look like when someday it's clean. And one of my friends, Dad's a pastor, he even translated what you said into Greek, Dad. But she didn't clean up her room. And he said, that's what we do to God. We go to him and say, Lord, my life is yours. What would you have me to do? We get a sense this is what I should do. And then we say, I don't really want to do that. We must act upon what he says. And then we're going to find he's there. I just want to promise you that. When you simply take a step, have you ever taken a step simply doing something for only one reason? Because you know God would have you to do it. That's when I found out in my life more often than any other time that God is real, that he is there. And that's where he brings us to this point. And don't doubt. And don't doubt. That word does not mean have no questions. I'm telling you, when trials come, every man and woman of God I've ever met has a lot of questions, and we don't just bury them. Read through the book of Psalms. It is loaded with questions. Every person who grows strong in the faith is willing to go to God and know that God's not going to be bowled over by my questions. We just bring them to the right place. What he's talking about is this. The word really means, it's translated out, dividing the thing out, parsing it out. So here's the way it plays out. All right, God, what would you have me to do? And you get a sense this is what I should do. And you think, well, a part of that is okay. Okay, I'll do a part of that, but not this part. Or we parse it out this way. I look into the future, God, and if I do that, oh man, that's going to make my girlfriend mad. It'll make her parents mad and my parents mad. And we start thinking about the consequences of doing what we think God would have us to do. And then we think, it's too hard. Next time, I'll do what you have me to do. Well, sometimes we don't do what God would have us to do because we think it's going to be too hard to open up our lives or the consequences of it. Let me just tell you this. There's only one person we have to fear in this world. The fear of God is the beginning of wisdom. If we obey him and want to follow him, then it will be better for you and for everybody else. And your life won't be blown back and forth, like James says. It won't be blown back and forth. Instead, your eyes only have to be fixed in one direction. And that is upon the one person who loves you with an everlasting love and wants you to become mature and complete, lacking nothing. All right, I have so many illustrations I want to tell you about this. You have to invite me back again someday. So maybe the best thing for me to do is just sort of sum it up. Okay, you go out into the world, there's always trials, right? James says many kinds. He says poverty is a trial, riches is a trial, many kinds of trials. So when it comes, it's really hard. You don't know what to do, but you consider. Okay, I'm a follower of Jesus. Okay, I'm going to consider this trial a joy, and I'm going to let God finish whatever he wants to do so that I'll become complete. But I don't know what to do, so you ask God. But what you sense is when you ask God, he asks you to do something that's really hard. What do you do then? What do you do then? My brothers and sisters, James was writing to people he loved with an everlasting love. I love Trinity students, and you weren't here when I was here. But if I were here, I know I'd love you too. I just tell you the same thing Pastor James said to people he loves. I say to you, ask him. Your Father is real. He'll show you something. And do what he says. And you will find that he is there. And if you have doubts about this, I guess I should end the very same way that every sermon done in a place where Jesus is Lord should end. And that is we have to fix our eyes upon the one whom we follow. Upon Jesus himself, who went through the greatest trial in all of history. He went to a cross. He knew he was going to go there. So he prayed. So, Father, my request is this. I pray that this cup of facing this physical, excruciating death on a cross and bearing the sins of the world might be taken from me. You remember that prayer? It's a good prayer. Do you remember the second part of it? But your will and not mine. And he went to the cross and accomplished the greatest accomplishment of his life, which is he accomplished our salvation, your salvation, with the promise that he's not going to leave us alone until we are mature and complete and lacking nothing. In that particular time of trial, the world threw all that it could, all the trials possibly could be thrown upon Jesus. So I'm going to give you this to look at, and I'm going to read you what happened on that cross. This is a picture from Rio de Janeiro. Do you know the Christ the Redeemer statue? It stands about 100 feet tall over the city. A few weeks ago, a lightning storm hit the Christ the Redeemer statue. It did not destroy it. Instead, as you look at that incredible picture, the lightning hit him, and as the people saw it, it looked like that instead of that lightning bolt destroying the Christ the Redeemer statue, it was sending out rays of light from the statue into all the world. And that's exactly what happened. And that's what can happen in our lives. There is no trial in this world greater than our Father. He knows what he's doing when he allows things to come into our lives. So when that happens, and you're questioning, will I follow him or will I doubt his goodness? Listen to what the Hebrews writer said in Hebrews chapter 12, verses 2 and 3. Keep the picture up there. We will fix our eyes upon Jesus, who for the joy, he considered this a joy. And the joy is you and me. It's amazing, isn't it? Our rescue was his joy, who for the joy before him endured the cross, scorned its shame, and then sat down at the right hand of the Father with his work completed. Consider him who endured such opposition from sinners, so that you, whatever you face, will not grow weary, and you will never lose heart. May this happen in your life, to his glory.